Stefan Bussey to talk about roadway markings for cyclists at a signaled intersection. Stefan is remarkably for this seminar is an undergrad civil engineering honors student. So with that,
Great. Well, thanks for coming today. Again, my name is Stefan Bussey. Today I'll be speaking a little bit about the research that I've done in conjunction with Dr. Christopher Vincier, who's a professor in the Civil Engineering Department at Portland State, and Peter Kuhns, who's in the back there. He's the manager of the Signal and Street Lighting Division at Portland Bureau of Transportation. And what we looked at was the effectiveness of the current roadway markings and signage that is used to indicate where cyclists should wait at signalized intersections in order to get a green light. And this is at specific intersections. I'll get a little bit into the background as we go along. And then an alternative marking that we proposed and tested. So just to go over what we're going to be discussing today, we'll just go over some basics of vehicle detection and how signalized intersections work that use detection, just get everyone on the same page in case you're not familiar with how some of those things operate. Issues related to detection and cyclists. A little history of the existing markings that are currently in the MUTCD. That's the basically document which has all the tools which traffic engineers can use to basically mark the road, help people decide where to go, control. Oh, no problem. So just what they can use basically for their job. We'll go over just the question where that came from, what the impetus for the research was, the existing research out there, and then just the study and the results. So to start, I just want to go through a quick mental exercise here. And if you can see this picture, it's sort of a typical intersection in a lot of areas in Portland. This is down in Southwest, I think it's 35th and Multnomah. And for a second here, you can just picture in your head, if you were to arrive at this intersection and you were going to go straight, so you're going to go through basically no left, no right, just where you would wait if you were driving a motorized vehicle, just to get a sense of where that spot is. And then do the same thing, but picture yourself riding a bike up to this intersection and where you would wait. And really, ultimately, the question is, does it matter? Is there a difference between that car and the bike and what happens based on where you're waiting? And the answer is yes. Typically, a car will probably wait about in that position, just a few feet off the center line. And often, that's totally fine for them. Cyclists may wait in very different positions. This could be one of them. So this is some footage I took out there back in May. And you can see this guy's waiting on the curb. Basically, his foot's on the curb. He's out of the way. He's going through. He's going straight there. I watched the video and saw him go all the way through. And really, the big question then is, will he ever get a green light? The answer, unfortunately for him, is no. Not unless someone comes and helps him out. And that just has to do with how this intersection works. And I'll go back here for a second. This original picture, you can see these sort of circles that are in the roadway. Those are actually sensors or detection that is used to sense the presence of a vehicle so that the signal knows someone's there and needs to get a green light. And not all intersections operate this way. A lot of them do. And the idea is a car, a bike, whatever, sort of triggers the sensor to let someone know, basically the signal controller know that a green light is needed, and then you get the green. So you can see the car is pretty much over those sensors. Not going to have an issue. We'll be detected, and we'll get that green. And I'll probably refer throughout the presentation as those circles as loops. That's a pretty common term for them. They come in different sizes in Portland. They're about 6 feet diameter circles, but they can come in different sizes and shapes. So the cyclist, you can see he's not on that sensor. He's not over the loop. You can see the loop is actually right out here. It's kind of hard to make out in this picture. But unless someone hits the push button or a car comes behind him to trigger the sensor, he's going to be waiting there for a long time. And that's an issue that cyclists face. So again, this is just a little diagram of how that works. You just get wires that go through the pavement to the controller and then sends that signal that someone's there once they're over it. And there are a couple issues around it. We discussed the first issue around detection in cyclists. The first is this position. The fact that these loops are placed in the roadway, typically where the vehicle is going to be traveling, not necessarily where the bike will be traveling. Bikes may travel there, but it's not as common necessarily for them to end up over that loop just based on the position of where they're installed. And these are just some pictures of different loop configurations and issues you might have. So we're looking at this circular loop here which is most common in Portland. And the issue is if you're over the center here, you're probably not going to get a green. So you could be over the loop, actually, but you still may not get your green light because it may not know you're there. And that just has to do with the operation of the detection, its sensitivity, lots of other things. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty on that. But the person over here, he's just not over. He's right on the edge, but he's actually probably not over the loop in this picture. The most sensitive spot, really where you want to wait, is right over the edge. And ideally, you want your bottom bracket. That's where the pedals basically meet the bike. You want that centered over the edge of the loop because that's probably the most concentrated mass of metal in your bike. Even if you're a full carbon fiber bike, there's going to be some metal in that part of your bike. So that's really what you want. And those are issues that you have with detection. Now, engineers know this. We've known this for a long time. I shouldn't actually refer to myself as an engineer. I'm an engineering student. But anyways, so they have tools to do something about it and to help cyclists know that to get a green, they need to do something. And they have two existing markings. These are in the MUTCD. That's the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. Like I said before, that's basically the toolbox that traffic engineers have to use in order to get their job done. And they can go outside of this document. There are different ways to do it. They can apply formally to experiment. They can apply for exceptions. But ultimately, most municipalities, most engineers are going to stay within this document just because you can expose yourself to additional liability if you do something that's outside of this document and then something happens. And you can see the first option you have is you can place this roadway marking. You probably have seen this around town, some of you, if you're cyclists. And that's supposed to help you determine where you're supposed to wait. Up here, this is where your front wheel is supposed to go. This is where your back wheel is roughly supposed to go. And hopefully your bottom bracket, where those pedals enter the bike, are supposed to go right over that. And that ideally will position you over the loop where you need to be in order to trigger the signal. Optionally, some places will also install this roadway, this sign that's mounted on the curb side of the road, just sort of next to it. It just helps you understand a little more what's going on there, because this isn't necessarily the most intuitively understood symbol, and we'll get into that. That's one of the things we did research, is how well people understand that. Now, just a little history before I get into the research we did, is these symbols, we sort of came into being around, turn of the 2000s, so around 1999 really became more common practice. They originally came, we suspect, from a Caltrans research that was developed down in California. And these are the first signs that were proposed. So there was some human factors research done in the comprehension of the actual sign. This was done by Ron Van Houten, and determined that the existing R10-22 sign, that's a technical number for that sign that I showed you previously, which is, I hope I get it right, this one. Or is it this one? No, it's this one. So they did determine that was probably the most easily understood. We did not find any research on the stencil at all. So we didn't understand it, didn't find anything there. It doesn't mean it's not out there, but we couldn't unearth any of it. They both were first recommended in 1999 by AASHTO in the Roadway Design Guide, and then adopted into the MUTCD in 2003. And when that was adopted, and there was no formal experimentation required. So in most cases, or often, the committee that basically allows that adoption to happen will make sure that there's some sort of experiment to determine the effectiveness on whatever is being adopted. So in this case, there wasn't. They didn't think that was necessary. So this is what we are basically existing conditions. This is how things are today. And the research question that we came up with is basically, are the existing roadway marking and sign, are they effective? And is there something that may be more effective? And where that basically came from, the impetus for this project basically came from me. I live in Southeast down on Clinton, if you guys are familiar with that area. And I come often, ride my bike home from school or to school, and I go through the LAD. And if you're familiar with the Seven Corners intersection, it's sort of a odd geometry. So the way it works is there are 4 different movements that get greens at different times. So one goes, and the next goes, and the next goes, and the next goes. Basically, 4 different movements have to happen every signal cycle. So every time you go through that signal operations. And if one movement doesn't have any cars there, that movement is skipped and makes it more efficient. That's why these signals operate this way. And I often will be riding down this way or coming up this way to school, and I can see that the movement that goes right before the one where I'm about to get that green. So I have a red, but I know my green is next, and my turn is next. is about to come up, and I can see that there's a cyclist waiting up at that intersection. So that's good, because I don't want to wait. I'm sort of impatient sometimes, especially if I'm late for class or whatever it is. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, I found myself getting up there right when the previous movement was getting their yellow and then to their red, and I was supposed to be getting a green, and I wouldn't get it. And when I get up there, I would see that the cyclist would be, right here. The loop would be right there, and the stencil would be about a foot from their, bike. So that got me thinking, well, I mean, if the stencil's right there, and all these people aren't using it on a really popular bike route, so people who use this route, cycle a lot, it would seem. And it happened, 3 or 4 times a week, which is pretty frequent, I thought. So it just got me thinking about whether or not the markings were effective. So I talked to Peter and I talked to Dr. Mencier about possibly looking into this, and they thought it would be interesting, and that's what we pursued. We did do some background, looking more for existing research on the stencil to see if there was any more comprehensional-based knowledge or other things done after it was initially put into the MUTCD. We only found one piece of research that was just released in September, actually. And this is all we found. Again, there might be other stuff out there. And this was done down in Florida. It was done for the Florida DOT. It was a report that was produced by, gosh, I can't remember, Florida State, but down in Tallahassee. And they did comprehension on just the stencil. So they also had a lot of other signs and roadway markings in there. But they also, one of those was a stencil. And they found that none of their research group, their subjects, understood the meaning of the stencil. No, they didn't answer the questions correctly. It's not super surprising. I give some caveats out there, is that they had 68 participants in that study. 20 were cyclists. Cyclist was identified as someone who was on the road for more than 5 miles a week. Doesn't specify if they were on a path. We don't know actually if that marking is even used in the Tallahassee area, which is what the study drew from for their study participants. And there were 48 non-cyclists. So it gives you like a baseline of maybe knowledge, but we wanted to sort of expand on that. And a place like Portland is a good place to do that, because hopefully here, with the amount of cyclists we have, maybe you get a best case scenario at least. We know what the worst is, 0. So the design of the study came in 2 different parts. We had a survey we administered, which was done both in person and online. So that's how we recruited our participants for the survey. And then we recorded observational data at 3 different intersections here in Portland. We recorded observations before any markings were applied, and then we applied 3 different scenarios to those intersections, only 1 to each, and determined whether or not there was an effect. So the first test case was we just used the stencil by itself. The second test case at the second intersection was the stencil with the sign mounted on the curb. And the third was an alternative that we proposed, which is this green-backed stencil. Basically, the idea was to sort of highlight the stencil. Also, green is becoming a more prevalent color in the cycling world. It's kind of understood as a place that's identified for cyclists, that cyclists are allowed to be there. And the idea was this would sort of give cyclists the permission to take that spot, because often, that stencil is in the middle of the vehicle lane or really close to it. And one of the hypotheses was perhaps people didn't wait over the stencil because they were worried that vehicles wouldn't like them being there. So this would sort of let everyone know that it was OK. We ended up installing something slightly different than this original design, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But those are the 3 test cases. So survey, the data collection, like I said, took part in 2 parts. One was online. I basically taped flyers to people's bikes in high-density bike parking areas, so around campus, at Timbers games, during big bike events like Providence Bridge Pedal and stuff like that. And they would have a QR code or a little short link and go to a survey that was done online. The other option was I did some surveying in person using a tablet and a survey software program and app. And I approached people at the events, again, like Sunday Parkways, the farmers market, and that's how I recruited those folks. So we had 227 complete responses for our survey. And I should probably give a little caveat. I wouldn't say everyone answered every question, but when I consider them complete, they answered you enough to actually be able to use the data. 81 of them were in person, and that we had a 94% response rate. So we had a pretty good response rate on that. And then we had 146 online, which was about a 16% response rate. So we're fairly pleased with that. And it took about 4 minutes to do the survey, so it was really quick, about 7 questions. Questions we asked were demographic information, basic demographics, where people would stop at a signalized intersection with one of the 3 test cases applied. So The first one we showed was this picture here was just a stencil, and 62 people saw that. And just to make it clear, when you took the survey, each person only got to see one of these scenarios. You didn't answer all three, you just got to see one. And what would happen is you were shown this picture, asked where you would wait, and then you would point either with a dry erase marker on a picture if it was in person, or click, and it would highlight that area if you were doing it online. So 62 people took that survey. 63 took the survey with a stencil and the sign. There's a sign up there. And then 102 ended up doing the green-backed one. And there's a little variation. That was primarily because of the in-person surveys. We started doing them. And before we could balance out the numbers, we had a lot of rain outs and ended up going towards the online survey after that. The survey done online automatically randomized and made it equal as the number of people who took each one. So we took the stopping position reason that they stopped there. That was really important to know. Also, how they interpreted the bike symbol. So similar to the University of Florida, or I don't know if it's University of Florida, I shouldn't say that. But similar to the study down in Florida, just the comprehension of the bike stencil, and then the interpretation of, it's called a blue light. It's a detector, or a light that comes on once the signal knows you're detecting. We're still sort of working on research involving that. I'm not going to talk much about it. But if you've been around town, there are some signals around here where once you're over detection, there's a blue light mounted right next to the signal head. And it comes on and sort of confirms the fact that the signal knows you're there. So video data collection. We took a lot of video, 302 hours. I spent a lot of time watching it. 955 observed cases logged. I only logged cases where the cyclist was the first person to arrive at the intersection on the red indication. So that's important. I didn't look at anyone else. If there was a car there beforehand, it wasn't considered an observation, because we wanted to make sure it was sort of just a clean slate for them. And then we had to filter out a lot of sort of results that maybe had influence on where they would stop. And I'll talk about that later on. We had 688 that we actually used in analysis. And I was only questioned once by the police, so that was good. They asked me for a letter from the city of Portland, and I said, you can call Peter at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, but I don't know if he'll be happy about it. Fortunately, they believed me. So the site selection was based on a variety of things. We wanted to make sure that there was no existing signage or marking there, so we didn't want to have people exposure to that marking at that intersection before we actually studied it. The loops had to be visible, so as you saw in the picture at the beginning, those circles were visible from just standing on a road. Sometimes they're not. The asphalt's overlaid the top, so that can change things. We wanted to make sure that actually, if it had loops there, that was operating based on detection. So I mentioned semi-actuated signal operation. It could have been fully actuated, it doesn't matter. But it just had to use the loops to determine whether or not someone needed a green. Have similar geometry, so I wanted to make sure that if there was a through lane and a left turn lane, that all the intersections were basically going to have a through lane and a left turn lane. The lane widths would be around the same width. We just wanted to make sure that everyone is having generally the same exposure to traffic and other basically variables, and we wanted to limit how many of those things could influence their behavior, and we just wouldn't be able to account for. And then obviously a popular bike route, because we wanted to make sure we had enough observations, and sort of drew on a variety of sources. One was the bike counts that the city of Portland does, which you can access online. They're pretty interesting. And then collected data from Sunday to Tuesday. We wanted to both get recreational riders who possibly would only be riding on the weekends, and then get people who ride on a more regular basis, maybe everyday commuters, stuff like that. And Tuesdays happened to be probably the peak bicycling day around here is what we determined. We looked at things like the bridge count on the Hawthorne Bridge to see where to collect that data or when. And we had, you can see the three intersections we collected at. One was Deacom and MLK. Ainsworth and MLK was the second one, and 33rd and Grant down in the northeast. You guys can guess which one I was questioned by the police at, and I'll tell you that it was a citizen complaint, and it'd probably be an interesting experiment for maybe the sociology department to determine which one and why, but I won't go into that because I'm in engineering. So just the basic geometry you can see is pretty similar across the board here. A little variation on Ainsworth and MLK. Does have a 20-foot cross-section from this stripe to here, but with this added sort of center line, I don't know what you would actually call that, it narrows it up a little bit, and you get a little bit closer from the edge of the loop to the curb. So that can play a significant role, and you'll see when you come to the results that it may have had a role. It's hard for us to determine, but just something to note. So this is the way I did my data collection. I would establish what I would consider zones before I would go out in the field. So you can see, basically 0 to 5 feet from the curb would be one zone, then 5 to 10. Then the area over the loop would be 10 to 16 feet over the curb, whatever the leftover distance, and then other, basically zones, I would call them, because I need to categorize where people were stopping, and this is how I did it. Then when I would go out into the field, I'd set up the video equipment and put down masking tape based on those measurements. So this tape here, this is 5 feet from the curb. This is the stencil, so that's right at the edge of the loop, and you can see the loop sort of highlighted there. And then that's the center line. So I would know that zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, zone 6. And after I did that, I would leave. I would take the tape off the roadway before I left, because I didn't want to influence people's behavior by having something there. But I could, before I started actually logging video, using a transparency over a computer screen, could trace over the tape, establish those zones so I know where they were stopping, and then log their stopping position, being a little more confident about where I was placing them instead of sort of randomly guessing. So that was how we did that. Here are some results. We're going to get into that now. I'll just start with some basic demographic information about people. We found, most of our riders who answered the survey were more frequent riders. It sort of makes sense based on the way we were recruited. I tried to recruit at events like Sunday Parkways and Bridge Pedal, where we might get people who rode a little less frequently, but a lot of the people who responded were people who ended up having flyers taped into their bike just parked on the street around the area. Age, the demographic is a little bit older than we've seen in past surveys around cyclists in the area, but not too much, so it might be a little skewed to the middle here. You can see we don't have that much representation in the older groups either, and that's sort of not surprising. And then the gender split is pretty much conforms to what we'd expect. Portland has around this split, I think, normally for cyclists in general. And again, in study responses to studies done before, this has been sort of around on par with the gender split we found. So nothing too shocking or surprising to worry about. And then here is just sort of a breakdown of where people decided to stop. And this is everyone in the survey who had every circumstance. So I pooled all the results and looked at just where people would stop. And it was interesting to see that 57% of people reported that they would stop basically over the stencil. So that was good to see. That means people were hopefully using it, at least in that sort of circumstance where they were on a computer screen looking at something and pointing to it. So they don't have a whole lot of external stimulus. But at least this might be a best case scenario. And again, this is self-reported, so we don't know what really maybe would go on in the real world. And who knows if they're doing research online or whatever. But hopefully this is pretty good. And then I thought interesting, the second highest number of people were stopping over the curb. And I'll get into the reasons they basically reported for doing so later on here, which is right here. And so before you look at this, don't worry, I'm not going to make you stare at this and try to interpret everything. This is a little confusing, and I'll break it out for you in a minute. But the idea is this is everyone surveyed. And within each group, I broke out why they weighted where they did. So for instance, in this case, people who rated from 0 to 5 feet of the curb, this is everyone in that one group and their responses for waiting there. So 56% of the people said they waited, who said they were waiting 0 to 5 feet from the curb, did so because they wanted to stay out of the traffic. So I'm not going to make you look at this very long, because I did break it out a little bit so it's easier to read. Just understand that every category doesn't have all 221 people in it. The ends are down here, so you can see this one, 10 to 16 from the curb, which means they're over the loop. Not over the stencil, they were over the loop. Only had 9 people respond. And so those numbers, we don't know how reliable they are. We probably would like a bigger number there. But what's interesting is the people who waited 0 to 5 feet or 5 to 10 feet from the curb really were dominated by people who wanted to stay way out of traffic and wanted to be visible. So you can see that's a pretty significant number of folks. And important to consider when you're placing a loop, maybe that should be something we should think about a little bit. And over here, you have people still think that's important, but it's not as crucial. Here's sort of a little one-offs. These weren't very common responses, but I wanted to present them. Some people wanted to be able to step on the curb. Some people wanted to be out of the crosswalk, and then a few people stopped where they stopped because they wanted to be in the same direction, like basically in line with the travel direction. So if they were going to go straight, they wanted not to be able to go straight and then veer back over if there was a car parked. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that as a cyclist, where you're at an intersection and you kind of move off to the right and there's a car next to you, but then you get up to a car parked and you're next to the car driving alongside you, and it's hard to get over. So that's the reason there. And then why do you wait there? This question, same question, just a different breakout of responses. As you can see, that folks who waited over the stencil did so either to trigger the signal. So 51% people said they were doing it to trigger the signal, and 31% said because it was marked. They didn't know why it was marked, what the marking said, or at least they didn't disclose that. But they did say they waited there because there was a marking. So that's a positive thing. And you had some people that actually waited over the loop because of the marking or because they thought it would trigger the signal. Now, they're in the case where they might not actually get a green because they might not be over the proper spot as a cyclist to get a green. And then I thought it was interesting that some people here still thought they were triggering the signal even if they weren't over the loop, or that they waited where they did, 5 to 10 feet from the curb because the marking was actually on the roadway. But obviously, they didn't understand the purpose of the marking, because that really the intention is that you wait over it. The other really interesting finding was, of all 3 different scenarios we presented, there really was no significant difference between where people waited. So this is just the breakdown of people waiting over the stencil, how many people said from each category they would wait over that stencil or alternative stencil. But across all categories, the analysis showed that there really was no significant difference. And that was sort of a little bit of a surprise. But hopefully, like I said, this sort of represents a best case scenario. Now, almost to these survey results, the last thing we asked about, or that I'll discuss really here, is how people interpreted the roadway marking itself. And 45%, so remember 0 in Florida, 45% here said wait to trigger the signal. Now, I think that was fairly remarkable. It's good. Portland obviously has a very different demographic than a place like Tallahassee, so this could be maybe a best case scenario. But it was nice to see. Unfortunately, that means that 65% of people don't know what that means, because 33%, the next highest, thought it meant being a bike lane or a bike route. So that was the second most common response. Now we're going to get into the video results. So I'll go into what we excluded from this and why. We excluded people who got to the intersection, and right as they got up there, a car was following them, basically right behind them. We didn't want someone to feel like they heard the car and were going to move out of the way because it was there. People riding in groups. So if you're in a group, you're more likely just to sort of spread out and wait randomly. And it was also very hard to determine which person to basically call an observation. Would you call them all an observation? Would you call one an observation? Which one would you choose? Are you going to be biased in the person you choose because you want your results to be skewed in this way? So we got rid of those. People who ran the red, and that was largely because a lot of those folks would just sort of like roll up, barely put a foot down, and then just zoom through. A lot of it was early in the morning observations, and didn't feel like those are really valid. People riding on the sidewalk in other unusual circumstances. So this is a car following this guy. He just put his foot down, and then he's got a dog with him. So, having a dog with you might change where you decide to wait, and I thought that probably wasn't going to be a great data point. And the results were kind of interesting, and I'll sort of go through this with you guys so you can break it down a little bit. But what we found really was that the stencil with the sign and the green back stencil produced significant results. So that means before the stencil was applied, how many people stopped over the loop area, and after, more people were stopping over the loop basically after, if that makes sense. And I'll go through that one more time. This analysis looked at everyone who stopped, where they stopped before, and then compared how many people stopped over the loop before, and then how many people stopped over the loop after. So if you stopped over the stencil in this breakdown here, you're considered being over the loop. So how many people were basically induced to move over the loop. It doesn't necessarily indicate that they're stopping over the right spot, but it does show that more people were stopping over the loop based on the stencil and sign and the green back stencil. And here's the sign. We had a really ideal installation for the stencil and sign. You can see it's right next to the curb, right next to the stop bar. There's nothing blocking it. It's really visible. So we feel like this is a really good situation to put this sign up. I don't know if you guys noticed in that survey, that picture, the sign was sort of up in the bushes almost. And that's sort of just a reality of how things get installed in the field. But something to keep in mind. The second analysis we looked at was we knew that people were stopping over the loop more because of the stencil, but the question is, well, were they stopping over the right spot? Were they over the stencil more? Or were they just randomly arriving and stopping somewhere over the loop and happened to be, attracted to it because of the stencil or not? So what I did is I went back and I looked at all the data of people who stopped over the loop beforehand. And I determined where that stencil was installed and then figured out if people beforehand were stopping over that area or elsewhere. So does that make sense? It's sort of like, I know it takes a little bit to get, but basically I said beforehand, imagine this isn't here. If you stopped in this area, I would log you over like the stencil area. If you stopped elsewhere over the loop, you were elsewhere. And then I looked to see afterwards if there was a higher percentage of people stopping over the stencil area versus the rest of the loop afterwards. And you can see some significant results, again, in the stencil and sign and the green-backed stencil were produced. So you went from 40% people who had this situation, stopped over the stencil area before, to 78% of the people were stopping over the stencil area. So that means they were stopping over the right area. And the green-backed stencil, similar results from 57% who were stopping over the stencil area to 83%. So I found that pretty significant. And something that's good to consider. And you can see here how the greenback stencil got installed. I told you that it didn't necessarily get installed the way we originally intended. That's just the nature of what happens when a striping crew goes out. And sometimes they do things differently. Those guys like to get creative, and you get what you get. But it still was significant. It'd be nice to maybe sort of pursue that a little further and see if a larger one would have more of an effect. I did notice some issues, and I didn't record these observations, but it seemed like some people would put their front tire over the green instead of putting it over basically the two dashes, which is an issue because you may not get your green light if you're over the green. So that's something to think about a little bit. Peter's shaking his head, but, well, I should send you some video. A little comparison from the results. The one thing to keep in mind about surveys is they're all self-reported. So a little bit of grain of salt in there. Consider it maybe a best-case scenario for use of that stencil, and then it's definitely highlighted the importance that people place on safety and the placement of that loop within the roadway relative to where they're stopping. And then, as I said before, we had this ideal sign placement for the R-22 sign. That's the sign. And then the greenback stencil wasn't as we initially would like it, but it was still good. And those are the limitations I just talked about, sort of. I guess the other thing to keep in mind, we are in Portland. A lot of cyclists here. There's a lot of knowledge about cycling in the area. So again, like I said, this might be an ideal population to figure out, in the best cases. Things you can do. So you guys are out there. You have gained some knowledge today, hopefully. If you didn't, well, I apologize. But hopefully something was interesting. But the city of Portland has a memo that they have about bike detection. And you can read up on that if you're more interested in what they do. There's some little bit of jargon in there, but you should be able to figure it out. The biggest one that I should highlight is detection in Portland typically works in what we call, it's a non-locking call. So that's sort of what you'll see in the memo, which means is if someone's over the loop, it knows you're there. Once you get off the loop, it doesn't know you're there anymore. So if you want to get a green on your bike, you have to stay in that spot, because once you leave, it doesn't know you're there anymore. So that's an important sort of little piece of tidbit information. You can always call City of Portland. I call them all the time when things go wrong, and I notice I've learned that public servants, they work for the public, so make sure you take advantage of those staff. So 503-823-SAFE or 823-CYCLE, and if you know a loop that needs to be marked or remarked, go for it. Make sure you give them a call. They're pretty responsive, and there's also this app, PDX Reporter, and again, share your knowledge. I can tell you about once a week I tap someone on the shoulder at an intersection and say, hey, just wait over there. You're never going to get your green. So people don't always like it, but I feel like hopefully I'm doing them a favor in the long run. Just a couple acknowledgments here. In the city of Portland, research wouldn't have been possible without the help from Rob Birchfield, Roger Geller, and Mark Haynes. Of course, Peter, but it goes without saying. Droid Survey provided us with a survey app for free, fortunately, so it was nice of them, and so I thank them. And then we got some of the research on the original research for the sign and stencil from Robin Houghton at Western Michigan University, and then Richard Moore from the MUTCD. That's it. So you guys have questions, I'm happy to talk. All right, so lots of questions. I'll let...
My name is Jonathan Nasser, and my question is regarding the use of, I'm assuming they're motion-activated sensors. I see them above lights sometimes. They're not like red light cameras, but how do those, are they motion-activated sensors, and how do they play into the future of detection?
Yeah, so I mean, that's sort of one of the things I mean, they're not motions or video, basically, or radar. It sort of depends on the situation. Those are the two most common other forms of detection. And I'm not really an expert on detection, but based on this research, I mean, one of the recommendations I would make is if you could go and spend a little extra money, it's more expensive for these, to use radar or video detection. It possibly might be more effective because you wouldn't have to do it. Peter's sort of grimacing over there.
Are you saying that in Portland, are you looking for those?
Well, I live in Beaverton,
Yeah.
like that area, but I see them quite often. I'm not sure.
Beaverton uses a lot of video detection, and so they will have the video look for a spot on the bike lane, just like we do with the loop.
I see.
So you can set the video to look at certain areas to figure out whether or not someone's there. There are issues with that, like any sort of technology. Not everything works perfectly, but yeah. So that's one of the options.
That I have a question. That bike stencil symbol has got to be the most confusing symbol I've ever seen. It's showing a bicycle perpendicular to where it should be positioned. Somehow they got to come up with a symbol that shows the bicycle parallel with that line. This morning I came across City Street that was pretty interesting over by the light rail, Southeast 8, near Division, and they have a long vertical line with an X through it. It looks like they're going to paint something there.
Yes, that's what they do is they go out there and they bring actually a bike with them, find the most sensitive spot, and probably the best spot. It's not just about sensitivity. They don't want to put you in the crosswalk if there's something there, and then they mark it, and then the guys come out. So yeah, they're going to mark it there.
Did you do any studies with other types of symbols?
No, just those. We're sort of limited with what we can actually employ in the field just based on the MUTCD. So even just applying that green background, is sort of a little bit of a push without giving a formal experiment approved.
You mentioned about Portland having a different demographic from Tallahassee or Florida.
Sure.
Why did you use Florida? Why didn't you use like cities that are more, related to Portland that have the same demographic
Well,
like
so
Seattle?
that research was done independently down in Florida. That's why they use it. And yeah, we didn't have any influence over that at all. So we didn't research in Florida. We researched here, and this is because of the location. That's where we actually are located. And it was tough, to distribute a survey or do this research in other locations would have been a real challenge just based on time and stuff. So it would be interesting to do it elsewhere, though. Yeah.
Could you state your name?
I'm Jacob Hansen. I was curious, at the end of the survey, did you tell people where they should wait?
No, I didn't, but I did. I know, I felt bad about that a little bit. There was a sort of a disclaimer there that if they had any questions, they could email me. And so I got people emailing me, and I'd write back and say, hey, yeah, that's where you're supposed to wait. Or that blue light, there was a picture of the actual blue light there.
So what I wonder is, Ilya Solovyev. So have you received any feedback or consideration from City of Portland, or would you expect any future doing research in the same area to get more significant results? With
It could be nice to do more. I mean, I think the downside is that it's pretty time consuming. So finding that time is the challenge.
So Peter Kuntz, City of Portland. We definitely want to do more research in this topic. One of the things that was mentioned was video detection, how effective video detection is for bikes. So we have a test location where we're looking at some cameras, both video, and then also we've done some things with microwave, and then also a thermal detection camera. So there's a lot of different opportunities for research in this. You can make a small project out of it. So if there is interest, feel free to email Stefan or myself or Chris, and we'll be happy to plug you in. The user-friendly nature of the infrastructure, it's easy to detect a car. It's easy to detect a hunk of metal that big. We've done that for years. Bikes are more difficult, and especially bikes that if you're not well lit. The video detection does not do a very good job of detecting bikes at night. So those sorts of things are things that we think about. If we choose detection, we have to think about bikes using it all 24 hours of the day. In fact, you know, if you think about even 5:30 at night right now is really tough for the darkness. So those sorts of aspects are all things that need to be studied. And at the national manual, the example of the bike stencil being turned is just something that we hadn't really thought of. We wanted to make it as visible as possible to somebody that's coming up on it. So, you know, there's not, as Stefan mentioned, there's not a lot of research. We don't have a lot of data on what is the best thing to do. So, as we think about bike research, it's really important. There's a lot of areas that are ripe for study.
Yeah. And I think one thing to point out when it comes to the research is Portland does have a lot of cyclists. A lot of places just don't, so it's not really a priority for them.
I'm Rayleigh Stark. I typically stop in the center of the lane, and I also heard that is the safest just because you're right in front of the vehicle. And I was wondering, when these stencils are placed, are they placed just because of the loop detector, or are they placed also because it is the most ideal spot for a cyclist to stop?
Well, I mean, they're placed often to the curb side. You'll notice they're not usually placed on the left side of the road unless it's for a left turning lane. But they're always placed on the edge because that's the most sensitive spot. So it's really just the nature of where it is. But even if you wait over that stencil, you're still going to be basically right in the lane for the most part. You might be, you know, on the outside, just on the outside of where typically a car would travel, but you'll still be out there. And people would have a hard time squeezing past. They'd have to be a really aggressive driver to want to do something like that.
John Landolf. I'm curious, one-to-one versus putting in stencils and hoping people interpret them versus adding more sensors. Is there a major price difference? Is there technical barriers to just adding more sensors to the area?
Yeah, I mean, that's something Peter probably could address better than I. I'll say that there definitely is. You know, there costs more money, so the more you put in, the more it's going to cost. You do have limitations within the signal cabinet about how many sensors, loops, you know, you can actually have. Operations, yeah. I mean, we do put in the city, I shouldn't say we, the city puts in bike loops in bike lanes often, or places where they know cyclists are going to wait, and those are better at picking up bikes. You'll notice they're rectangular often in shape, or what, a parallelogram, is that what they're called when they're diagonal? So, yeah.
So cost of a detector is nominally about $500 installed for each approach. The cost of paint, about $50. So
yeah. we
like being able to mark the existing detectors. So that's what we try to do. So if you call in and complain, that's what we'll do for you, because it's cheaper. It's the first step. Now, the question becomes, well, is it good for all users? Does everybody feel comfortable? And the answer probably to that is no. So that's why we look for bike lanes, then we put detection in and those sorts of things. So. Yeah. Then one of the other things that Stefan did for us as an intern was look at how many people are actually getting off their bike and maybe going to hit the push button, because that is something that we tell people to do. We don't like to do that necessarily. We'd rather have you detected by a loop, but we also don't have endless amounts of money. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, and I did record actually push button use. I didn't report on it here, but I recorded every person who hit the push button. It's a little hard to see. Sometimes you sort of have to assume they were hitting it. So I didn't want to, it wasn't like, you know, data I could really report on with confidence, but I looked at that, and there's quite a few people who do use it.
Rachel Hanna. Since you can see the loops for detection, what would you do differently for signage or anything for loops that you couldn't detect?
They do the same thing. Basically, the marking is the same exact marking. Okay. I mean, that's really what you have to work with currently.
Aiza Malik. My question was that since more and more people are using bikes nowadays, and although the survey in Portland was better, but how can we make people more aware of where to park and what stencils actually are, because most people don't know what they are?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's tough, just public education, people sharing their knowledge, things like this, hopefully help people understand a little better. I mean, that sign helps, though, you know, it can be a challenge to put it in. And one of the things that traffic engineers face sometimes is having too many signs at an intersection. So then you just don't see any of them. People just sort of like zone out, and I shouldn't say zone out, but it's just too much going on, so don't notice them. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're sort of looking at. That's why we proposed that alternative stencil. And I don't think it's fair to really expect people to understand how traffic signals operate in the general public to know that you have to be over a certain spot. We don't expect vehicles to know where they're supposed to wait to get a green. So ideally, we won't expect cyclists to know where to wait to get a green. So it'd be nice to come up with some sort of solution where that wouldn't be the case. And I know it's sort of like a pipe dream in some ways, but yeah. Try to make it better at least.
So as cyclists, people can easily recognize the signs or stances. You just show the result. But as a vehicle users, I'm sometimes confused about the sign. Should I stop behind or next to? So my question is there might be a difference of the perception of the sign or stencil between the non-cyclist and cyclist. So do you know any a similar study to explore these kind of differences?
No, I don't know of any research when it comes to vehicle operators and their interpretation and how they react to that sign and stencil. It didn't seem, there's probably none out there, I would assume, just because based on the sort of search we did to try to figure out what sort of body of knowledge about the sign and stencil existed, there was really nothing, basically little to nothing. So that's always a consideration, though. That's one of the reasons why when we installed that green back stencil, we were careful not to get too crazy. I should say. Crazy is maybe a bad word, but engineers don't get crazy.
Brian Blanc. I was just going to ask, kind of building on what she said, have you guys considered, I mean, I guess it's not your responsibility, right, but is there anyone considering putting maybe words around besides colors around?
We talked about that, so that was something that was proposed as an alternative. One of the issues is that those wear out really fast. Text on the roadway is something that's hard to maintain. Even the stencils themselves, you'll notice around town, fade fairly quickly. So just the upkeep is challenging, and we try to design things so that once they're installed, they don't have to be revisited as often. Just because it's with budgets being tight, it's less likely that it gets done. So that's one of the things. But yeah, it was definitely something we considered.
Considering Michael Schomburg, considering there are a myriad of signs on the roadway, and interpretation can be an issue, do you find that people just not knowing that a section is in fact triggered is an issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sort of, I wouldn't expect people to understand whether or not an intersection is running based on detection. I just think that's something we can't, as engineers or in general, have as common knowledge that the public would understand. And there's a lot of misconception of how that works as well. I mean, a lot of people think it's weight-based. They haven't used weight-based detection in a really long time. Maybe it's still out there in a few cases, but probably, yeah, Peter shakes his head no. If it is, it's not working. So, it's just stuff, if you're an engineer, sure, you might know this stuff, but I wouldn't expect, like, my mom or my dad to drive down the street and know that they had to be there to be detected. So signs and stencils are a different thing. Those are things that we do hope that people will understand. We put them there because we don't expect them to understand everything, but we want them to know how to use what's been built.
Gabriel Russo, grad student. Kind of a personal question. What is your qualitative opinion, I guess, of the perfect way to dress an intersection that may not have anything? So if you had an endless budget, you could just make an intersection, what would it look like?
Oh, God. I mean, that's sort of a tough question. Depends on the intersection. There's a lot of variables in there. I mean, I sort of have thought a little bit about maybe, say, we'll reduce it to the intersections that we were looking at. So maybe that first intersection that I showed you that picture of, one thought I had, and this is just sort of me brainstorming, would be to there's no bike lane there necessarily, but if you could stripe a bike lane just up to the intersection for the first like 50 feet, that maybe would corral people into an area waiting next to the curb, and then you can install a bike loop there, so they'd be more likely to wait over it. Something like that might produce a better effect. They'd be, you know, next to the curb, so out of the way of the traffic. People concerned about safety wouldn't have to necessarily be out there in the vehicle lane, and then they'd still have a loop to get them a signal. But, you know, yeah, I haven't really explored that very much, and so take that answer a little bit with a grain of salt. You know, that's just sort of me thinking out loud right now.
Hi, Andy Kading, undergrad. So as a cyclist, I find the green markings that the city has been experimenting with incredibly helpful as an identifier for cycling routes and what I should do. And I was, you know, you guys tried a stencil with green backing,
sure,
which I've seen around town, or at least I could imagine a scenario where it would be very identifying. Do you know if there's any movement toward, from AASHTO's side of things towards accepting a more uniform standard of cycling signage, like a green back or green lanes?
Well, I mean, the green lane, that green paint is what's actually specified in the MUTCD currently to designate basically a cycling spot. It's meant to really, I think, generally indicate an area of conflict. Is that right? I can't remember off the, no, Peter's shaking his head. It's not defined.
It's still experimental.
Okay.
So the MUTCD is, back when we did original study, we did blue. We actually looked at blue, and the blue seemed to work to identify conflict areas. That's how we originally used the color of the pavement. But blue is reserved for disabled parking and those sorts of needs. So FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, said, well, let's try green. So that's how we got to green. So green is what we're using in conflict areas and in bike boxes, but it's experimental. And so we're still trying to sort that out. How do you use green? The National Association of City Transportation Officials came out with some green ideas, and those discussions are going on too. So you kind of have two different efforts up front to figure out how are we using green, how effective is it, and how do we take advantage of sharing information about what we expect users to do.
Cool. Well, if you guys want, before you go, I forgot to show this during the presentation, but I have some video, that before and after video I'll show you real quick. So let me get it up. It's kind of interesting. This is at, this is after, this is before. So this is at 33rd and US Grant Place. This is down in Northeast. Let's see if it pulls up. Yeah, so just before you start looking, just watch. I'll say in the corner you'll see the pedestrian signal, and watch that, because what happens in this video is it'll start flashing, which has that, you know, don't walk hand flashes. And typically at the end of that flashing, you would expect a green light to happen for your approach. Now, if there's no one there, it'll just go back to that walk man sign, and then it'll wait again until it comes up, it's that turn again. So you'll see in this video, it's speeded up, but that guy just got there. He's been waiting for a little while. Now watch, see, he's flashed, and went back, didn't get a green, got to walk. But then, fortunately, the guy got lucky. He had another cyclist friend come push the button. They're talking. I can imagine them saying, like, "Curse you, Portland. Why don't you make your signals work for me?" And then eventually they get their green. And then, so that's the before. We did install the signal, or sorry, the marking, not a signal. Let's see if this comes up. So this is after. Guy shows up. Oh, he's not on the loop. Hey, what's that? Kind of interesting. Maybe I should put my bike over it. And there you go. He gets on it.
That's the green marking.
And that's the green marking. And he's good. I didn't go through the whole thing, but so, you know, there is an effect. You can see people respond to that marking. Unfortunately, it's not 100%. We wish, or I wish, that it would be a little more effective. Yeah. But that's it. Thanks, you guys. If you have any other questions, come see me.